Okay, we are back here in the accessibility track of our first Comcast Labs Connect Innovation for Inclusion conference. And as promised, we are about to embark on a fascinating presentation from Mr. Dalton Banks. So heads up, this is the part where we get to talk about some video games and maker culture. So a little bit of a spoiler alert there. Dalton is the co-founder of Bansen Labs. Bansen Labs is a startup making the world more accessible for people with disabilities. Coming out of the Lift Labs program, Bansen Labs recently piloted its first product, Xogo, that's Xogo, with Comcast, enabling users with disabilities to control the X1 platform using alternative controls such as wheelchair joysticks. So imagine that, being able to use your own assistive technology with your TV experience for the first time. Now, before starting Bansen Labs, Dalton developed testing tools for robotic clinical diagnostics at Siemens Healthcare. He gained clinical research experience at Penn Medicine's Rehab Robotics Lab and earned his MS in robotics and BS in bioengineering at UPenn. Dalton and his wife live in the Grad Hospital neighborhood of Philadelphia, where he's chasing the perfect home espresso setup. Another fun fact is Dalton once played Tetris in lights on the side of the Sierra Center in Philadelphia at midnight using Play-Doh. I'm sure we'll hear at least a little bit more context on that during Q&A. So we're going to let Dalton take it away with his presentation.
Hi, I'm Dalton Banks, co-founder of Bansen Labs, and we're developing an accessibility device called Xogo, which you may have seen in the Comcast Accessibility Lab. And we actually got our start in video game accessibility, which has been getting a lot of attention in the inclusive design world recently. You may have been introduced to the space via the Xbox Adaptive Controller, but there's a long, interesting history of accessibility in gaming, and I want to take a quick tour through some highlights and see what we can take away. First, I'm going to introduce you to Mark, and I'll come back to our story with him later. Mark has cerebral palsy, which affects his movement abilities as well as his ability to speak, so he uses an iTyper to communicate. Because of the limited options available to him for adaptive gaming, he hadn't been able to play console video games before we met him, and he was very interested in playing FIFA on the PS4. Now, there are actually millions of potential gamers like Mark who may not be able to use a standard game controller, and until recently, there was very little industry support for physical accessibility. This has finally been shifting over the past couple years, perhaps most prominently with the release of the Xbox Adaptive Controller, or XAC, which allows certain assistive devices to connect to the Xbox as if they were a game controller, as you can see in this graphic. If the XAC was your first time becoming aware of game accessibility, you might get the impression that this is a recent effort. But as I'm going to show you, this is very much not the case. Now, I want to point out this device on the right here. It's called a sip and puff controller, which you use with your mouth. And this particular device is a nice jumping off point to see how things have developed over the past 50 years. As you can see, we've had devices like this as far back as the 60s, and probably even earlier. This one was used for typing, and we can also see around this time the first tilt sensor, like you have in a phone, controlling a wheelchair, as well as the first eye gaze controlled wheelchair, which was actually developed out of a NASA project. Not only did we have these input devices, but for gaming specifically, have you ever heard of the Nintendo Hands-Free? After receiving a letter from a girl who had lost both her hands, Nintendo actually developed a sip and puff controller with a chin switch for the NES all the way back in 1989, which was available for a while by phone order. But the history of adaptive gaming actually goes back even further than that. A couple of engineers developed a custom circuit for the Apple II that lets you pause the entire computer with a button press and pulls up a menu allowing you to select your next action, which, for instance, allows someone to play a game like Pac-Man using only a single switch. This is actually a video someone made a few years ago after tracking down one of these adapters and managing to get everything up and running. By the way, this board features an impressive 600-page user manual, which just shows the level of commitment makers had toward accessibility, even back in the 80s. So we've had the technology for people with physical disabilities to game for over half a century. And we've known it was an issue, as you can see from Nintendo's project. So what took so long for this to become mainstream? And a big part of the answer, and for this presentation, I'm calling it the Great Divide, comes down to the proprietary ecosystems that developed around each game console on one hand, in contrast with the PC, which standardized on a mouse and keyboard as a way to access any PC made by any manufacturer. So assistive devices were able to just produce mouse and keyboard output and instantly allow you to control any PC, whereas every console had its own unique interface. And for this reason, if you're physically disabled, PCs have for a long time been your platform of choice, even if many of the games you want to play are console-based. Meanwhile, after the Nintendo hands-free, there was virtually no interest from console manufacturers in developing their own adaptive devices, most likely due to the comparatively small market size. But despite the lack of support from the big console manufacturers, this didn't stop people from coming up with all kinds of solutions. A guy named Ken Yankovic is something of a legend in the adaptive gaming world. He was an aerospace engineer who started building custom controllers for gamers with disabilities on request back in the 80s with the Atari, and continuing as the PlayStation and Xbox came out. The most popular configuration was the quad control, with a sip and puff and chin joystick. It actually became personally relevant as he later developed Parkinson's, and by the time he was forced to stop production, he had personally shipped over 800 of these units to gamers with disabilities. Now, another problem with consoles during this period is they actually doubled down on closing their peripherals ecosystems by not only using non-standard communication, but they actually started encrypting the communication between approved controllers in the console. So this means instead of an independent maker being able to make a box that handles its own communication with the game system, now your only option is to literally rip apart an authorized controller, pull out the PCB, and figure out how to solder it up inside your custom adaptive controller, which is much more expensive and time intensive and means fewer people will have access. This was done both to support licensing agreements, but also to start cracking down on cheating, like gamers who would use custom modded controllers to gain an advantage. But then along came these third-party dongles for competitive gamers, which were kind of a gray area in the market. They acted as a pass-through, so gamers could use their modded controllers to play, but you also had to plug in an official controller to handle the encryption. And so for a long time, these dongles became the best solution to get disabled gamers connected to consoles. There are actually a number of nonprofits focused on accessibility in gaming that started during this time, and they would use these dongles as one of their main ways to get gamers connected. And you can see a snapshot of how they were thinking about accessibility in this blog post from 2012. So actually pretty recently, where he's actually excited about the prospect of being able to use a PC to connect to the assistive devices like eye trackers, then pass that through to the dongle after configuring the dongle appropriately, plugging the dongle into the console, and also plugging the official controller in for authentication. So you have this janky, expensive setup with noticeable lag. You might get a new console update and the firmware doesn't work for a few weeks, but at least it gets gamers up and running with these consoles. And you can see they also started thinking about things like a precursor to the XAC that would streamline this setup a bit. And in this case, they're going back to ripping out the board from an official controller, so you don't have to worry about plugging it in and the extra wires and lag. Also, in 2014, as Ken Yankovic was starting to slow down, a retired electrical engineer named Fred Davison decided to pick up the torch and launched a more manufacturable version of Ken's quad control on Kickstarter called the Quad Stick, which takes us back to the XAC, which started with a design sprint in 2015, and after a few years of prototyping and feedback, launched as the first official accessibility hardware for gaming in the modern era. And obviously, it's an official peripheral with the encryption chip. Although still, if you want to use an eye tracker, you would need to use a PC, and to connect to a wheelchair, you need to first find someone to build you an open source circuit board to adapt the chair to the XAC. Now, full circle, you can see the Quad Stick was the sip and puff from that earlier image. And it's actually Microsoft's only recommended mouth controller on their website. And as a small operation doing the best they can, there's a lead time of about a month when you order them. And interestingly, if you go to the quad stick documentation, they actually still recommend getting one of these third-party dongles to unlock the full functionality, which is a bit reduced when connected to the XAC. So one of the interesting things to come out of all of this is that a lot of the accessibility issues have been perpetuated by a closed-off peripherals ecosystem, which in turn is largely driven by the attempt to regulate cheating. And this is admittedly somewhat of a tricky issue because cheating can certainly decrease the gaming experience for gamers who are not excluded from access. So let's just think for a moment about how this might be approached differently in a way that doesn't lock adaptive devices out. And I think this is also relevant to some other areas like web services that may reject automated forms of access, which can, for example, prevent screen readers that a visually impaired person might use. And I think one answer is to take a software approach instead, where you look at the behaviors of the users who are accessing your services, but don't make the assumption that someone's a bad actor just because they're accessing your service in a different way. And I mean, now we have algorithms that can tell you what breakfast cereal you should buy next. You can make videos of political figures saying anything you want them to. So we should be able to identify problematic behaviors without relying on hardware. As a very simple example, if the concern is that someone is, say, firing a weapon at superhuman speeds, then you can just limit the maximum rate of fire within the game, or give someone a warning or boot them based on that behavior. And you can still do this in an automated and scalable way. The irony is that the hardcore gamers can already get around the hardware limitations with the gray market dongles that inevitably crop up. So consoles and games are already having to implement some of the things I'm talking about. The only people who really lose out are those who just need access in the first place. The reality of the situation is that most people with disabilities are excluded from gaming as a result of some people who cheat. For us, that's extremely frustrating. When you have an industry with AAA titles like GTA 5, which made over $1 billion in its first 3 days, I think you have some responsibility to figure out how to make sure everyone can fully participate. And an easy way to make that next step is to handle access restrictions in software, but open up the hardware to both standard and third-party peripherals. So I hope you found some of this history interesting. There's a lot more there when you start digging. And I'll wrap up with a few takeaways. The main takeaway is closed platforms are always going to create systemic access barriers for people with disabilities. And what I mean by this is, just looking at the cheating situation, for instance, it's not that the intent is to exclude people with disabilities, and there may even be efforts made to address inclusion within the ecosystem, but without opening it up further, you have exclusion by default. And many people will find themselves unable to access your content, whether it's just too costly or time intensive for them, or whether there's simply no option for access at all. So 3 quick things to point out. First, it's really worth noting that DIYers, the maker community, retired engineers, can really be a huge asset in solving accessibility challenges, as we've seen from the tremendous effort invested over the years by people like Ken Yankovic. And the easier you make it for them, the more benefit you'll see here. You might even find that a whole community develops around accessing your content using a particular device developed by volunteers. Second, a good concrete step is to move away from requiring proprietary devices in order to access your service, whether that's a game controller or a remote control, and support standard inputs like mouse and keyboard access. Even better is to identify the underlying API that your users interface with and expose that as a developer API. Finally, as product designers, there's this familiar narrative about inclusive design where we go out and talk to users, observe how they interact with technology, learn some things we never realized before, come up with some creative solutions, and the world has been changed for the better. And this is all great, but there's so many use cases you inevitably leave out. And in this model, change really only happens in this phase of product development before you release the product. If the features are kind of fixed at product launch, then users with other needs are going to have to wait maybe even years for the next version and hope their use case is identified and built into the next one. But if instead you build in hooks to support a lot of configurability by the end user, potentially even open up a developer API, you can allow your user community to address their own needs without being dependent on you to anticipate them. So with all this in mind, remember Mark who wanted to play FIFA on the PS4? Well, because our Xogo device let us fully reconfigure the controls, we were able to experiment until we found something that worked for him. We had this intern named Sean who at the time didn't have much experience around people with disabilities, and you could tell he was feeling pretty awkward about how exactly to interact with Mark. And we were able to set them up so that Sean was controlling one of the players' movement, and Mark was handling passing and shooting with his head switch. It took some getting used to, but by the end, they were able to score, and you could see Sean's body language relaxing, those barriers starting to break down. And once they were done, we asked Mark what he thought, and he's using his iTyper. We're thinking he's going to say something like, "That was fun," or "Xogo's awesome," but instead he types, "Sean sucks at soccer." And Sean kind of jokingly pushed him, and you can see that body language. You can see Sean's pushing Mark, Mark's laughing at Sean. You can tell they've finally broken that ice. Sean's gone from this point where he's nervous about whether he can shake Mark's hand to where they're trash talking and ribbing each other. And these are the kind of moments we want to see more of. We want to see more people trash talking, which is a fancy way of saying bonding over shared experiences. And we can make that happen by designing systems that are more open. Thanks for listening. Again, I am Dalton Banks. Feel free to reach out at this email address, and I think I'll be taking a couple questions.
All right. Fantastic presentation. Always great to hear from you, Dalton. Love those takeaways. Love that story at the end there, putting Sean on blast for his FIFA skills. I do have some questions coming in here. We'll see what we have time for. Somebody is asking, for those who have recently lost their vision, what advice would you give for starting out with playing accessible video games?
Oh, great question. So I think vision accessibility has definitely gotten a lot more attention recently. There's a lot of challenges it poses because not many games are designed with vision access in mind from the beginning. But I think Christopher was talking earlier about some advances there. I would definitely check out. I think I found the article talking about the blind gamer who was talking about a great experience he had recently. So I think that's a good thing to look into. But yeah, things are always changing there, and I think Google's a great resource.
Fantastic. And then lastly, just to wrap up, I know we're short on time here, but how do those takeaways that you mentioned, how do they apply to AR and VR experiences?
Very good question, and I think that's a whole nother talk. But VR is actually, there's a lot of really difficult challenges coming down the pike with VR because there's a lot of assumptions that get made about what capabilities a user has if they're physically interacting with their environment, like with their body. So I think there's a lot that needs to be kind of addressed from the beginning as far as how you can decouple the ways a user can interact with the environment from assumptions about the capabilities of a user. And it's definitely something we want to see people thinking about from the beginning instead of trying to tack it on later.
Excellent. Then we can get back to more trash talking while we play video games, right? No matter who we are. I love it. So again, thank you for a great talk, Dalton. It's really cool to dig into kind of this side of things with video games and makers taking things apart. Really interesting to hear a lot of your takes on that. So I know you put your email up there. Did you want to encourage people to reach out to you with any follow-up questions on any social media?
Yep. Sorry, say that again.
I was just wondering if people ought to follow up with you on whether it's Twitter or LinkedIn, whatever you prefer, in addition to your email.
Oh yeah, that sounds great. So you can LinkedIn is Dalton Banks, and and Twitter, jdaltonbanks. So love to hear follow-up.
All right, fantastic. Thanks again, Dalton. And for those on the line here with us, hang in there. We'll be back with our next talk in just a few minutes.
Thanks.